My name is Laura Bennett. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my adult life, people have described me as reasonable, calm, dependable, the kind of woman who doesn't make scenes and doesn't need to be managed. I work in a role that rewards precision and restraint, where listening carefully matters more than speaking loudly. I've learned how to stay composed in rooms where emotions run high, and that composure has followed me everywhere else in my life. People often assume that because I don't react immediately, I don't react at all. That because I'm quiet, I'm unaware. That because I don't demand space, I don't deserve it. I've been underestimated more times than I can count. Not because I lacked strength, but because I didn't perform it in a way that made others comfortable labeling it as such. This story isn't about drama. It isn't about shouting, exposing secrets, or proving someone wrong in public. I'm not telling this to look powerful or righteous. I'm telling it because honesty, when it's quiet and complete, has a weight that spectacle never does. My husband cheated and then blamed me for it. Not all at once. Not cruelly at first. It happened slowly, through implication, through tone, through the careful rearranging of responsibility until I found myself apologizing for a betrayal I didn't commit. And I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I didn't fight to correct the narrative in real time. I waited. And that was worse. What follows is not the story of an affair. That part is painfully ordinary. It's the story of how blame is transferred, how disrespect is normalized, and how silence can be mistaken for compliance. It's about the moment you realize you've been assigned a role you never agreed to play. And what happens when you quietly step out of it? You won't hear me claim I was perfect. I wasn't. You won't hear me say I stayed because I was weak. I stayed because I was observing. I was learning. I was gathering clarity in a situation where noise would have only protected the wrong person. This story is about emotional justice, the kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind that happens when you stop absorbing blame that was never yours and stop interrupting someone who is in the process of undoing themselves. If you've ever been told you were too calm to be hurt, if you've ever felt your silence interpreted as acceptance, if you've ever wondered whether waiting could be more powerful than reacting, then you may recognize parts of yourself in what I'm about to share. So before we begin, let me ask you, have you ever noticed how differently people behave when they believe you'll never leave, no matter what they do? Before anything broke, before there was betrayal or blame or silence with intention, I was useful. That's the word that fits best, even if it took me a long time to admit it. To him, I was the stable one, the reasonable one, the woman who remembered deadlines, smoothed over awkward moments, and carried emotional weight without asking for credit. In social settings, I was introduced with phrases like, "She keeps everything running," or "She's the organized one." It sounded like praise. It felt like value. But it also quietly defined the limits of who I was allowed to be. I wasn't the woman people worried about losing. I was the woman people assumed would stay. Among friends, I was the listener. The one people turned to when things went wrong, not when things were exciting. I noticed patterns. I remembered what people said months ago and followed up when no one else did. If there was tension in a room, I absorbed it. If someone needed support, I provided it, quietly, without turning it into a performance. That invisibility was never framed as neglect. It was framed as trust. You're just so strong, they'd say. You don't need reassurance like other people. You're not the jealous type. Each sentence sounded complimentary. Each one removed a layer of care I was allowed to expect. In my relationship, I became the emotional constant, the background reliability that made his fluctuations possible. If he was stressed, I adapted. If he was distant, I rationalized it. If something felt off, I gave it time instead of giving it a voice. Not because I was afraid to speak, but because I believe maturity meant not reacting to everything. I was proud of that restraint. I told myself I didn't need frequent reassurance, that I didn't need to check his phone or question his stories or demand emotional labor on my schedule. I believed trust was proven by how little you needed to ask for. And so, over time, I became someone who asked for almost nothing. Looking back, I can see how clearly defined my role was. Even then, I was the one who made things easier, who didn't complicate his life with needs that might slow him down or make him uncomfortable. I smoothed transitions, softened disappointments, and absorbed small inconsistencies without comment. When something felt wrong, I didn't accuse. I adjusted. When plans changed at the last minute, I didn't protest. I rearranged myself. When affection became less consistent, I didn't question it. I assumed responsibility. That's how invisibility works when it's disguised as virtue. I wasn't ignored in obvious ways. He still spoke to me kindly, still relied on me, still described me as his partner. But there was a subtle shift in how my presence was treated, not as something to be protected, but as something guaranteed. I was dependable in a way that made me forgettable, and I participated in it. I see that now. I mistook emotional endurance for security. I believed that being low maintenance made me valuable, without realizing it also made me easy to take for granted. I didn't disappear overnight. I faded gradually, through 1,000 small moments where I chose understanding over clarity. The truth is, no one ever explicitly told me to be invisible. They just learned I would be. And once people learn that, they behave very differently. At the time, I thought this role made me safe, that being calm and accommodating insulated me from chaos, that if something were truly wrong, I would feel it clearly and unmistakably. I didn't yet understand that the earliest signs of harm rarely arrive loudly. They arrive quietly, disguised as comfort, trust, and familiarity. And I was very comfortable being underestimated. The first moment didn't feel important at the time. That's what makes it easy to dismiss. Even now, if I let myself, there was no confrontation, no raised voice, no obvious betrayal, just a comment, a small shift in tone. The kind of thing that could be explained away with stress, distraction, or humor if you wanted to be generous. And I did want to be generous. We were at a small gathering, nothing formal. A few people, familiar faces, easy conversation. Someone asked a question about relationships, something casual, and before I could answer, he laughed lightly and said, "Laura's just not very emotional about that stuff." It was said with a smile, no malice. People laughed, nodded, and moved on. I smiled too, but something tightened in my chest. Not pain exactly, more like recognition. A quiet internal note is being filed away. Because it wasn't true. I was emotional. I just processed privately. I felt deeply, but I just didn't broadcast it. And in that moment, something subtle happened. He defined me for the room. and I let him. After that night, nothing changed on the surface. We went home together. We talked about work, about plans. He kissed me the same way. If I had brought it up, I'm sure he would have said I was overthinking it. That it was just a joke, that everyone knew he didn't mean anything by it. And maybe he didn't, but intention has never been the same thing as impact. What stayed with me wasn't the comment itself, it was how easily it landed, how naturally it fit into the version of me everyone already believed in. The calm one, the unbothered one, the woman who didn't need much. I noticed after that how often my inner life was summarized for me. She's fine with it. She doesn't mind. You're not like that. Each time, I could have corrected it. I could have said, actually, I do care. I could have added nuance. I could have reclaimed my own voice in small ways. But I didn't, because correcting it would have required friction. And I had been rewarded my entire adult life for minimizing friction. The first small cut wasn't about cheating. It wasn't even about disrespect in the obvious sense. It was about being spoken for and realizing how quickly everyone accepted that version of me without question, including him. What hurt wasn't that he said it, it was that he never checked to see if it was true. From that moment on, I began noticing things I hadn't paid attention to before. Not with suspicion, just awareness. The way he answered questions about us without looking at me. The way my preferences were summarized instead of asked about. The way disagreements were reframed as my being easygoing rather than him being inflexible. None of it was dramatic enough to protest. That's what made it dangerous. And the most unsettling part wasn't that others ignored it. It was that I didn't interrupt it. I told myself I was being mature, that it wasn't worth nitpicking. Those relationships required tolerance, and this was a small thing. I reminded myself that I didn't want to be someone who created problems where there weren't any. So I did what I'd always done. I stayed quiet. I stayed composed. I stayed agreeable. But I remembered that moment became a reference point, not because it was cruel, but because it was revealing. It showed me how easily my silence could be used to finalize a story about me that I never approved. And once that door opened, even a crack, it didn't close again. The cut was small, but it was clean, and it marked the beginning of something that would only become visible much later, when the damage was already done. After the first small cut, nothing dramatic followed. That was the problem. If something had exploded, if there had been an argument or a clear betrayal, I would have reacted. I would have had language for it. But what came instead was repetition. Subtle, consistent, almost polite. The kind of pattern that doesn't register as harm until you're already living inside it. Disrespect didn't arrive as cruelty. It arrived as an assumption. He began speaking about me more than with me, not in private conversations, but in shared spaces, social settings, casual plans, even decisions that involved both of us. It was never framed as control. It was framed as efficiency. I'll handle it. Laura's flexible. She doesn't really care either way. You know, Laura, she's low maintenance. Each sentence landed softly. No sharp edges. No obvious insult. And because I didn't immediately object, they stacked on top of each other, forming a quiet narrative that followed me everywhere. I told myself it wasn't personal, that he was just simplifying things, that it was showing how well he knew me. I wanted to believe that being predictable was the same as being understood. But predictability, I learned, is often just the absence of resistance. When I did push back, gently, carefully, it was treated as an anomaly, a mood, a misunderstanding. You're reading too much into it. I didn't think you'd mind. You're not usually like this. That last one stayed with me. You're not usually like this. It wasn't said with anger. It was said with confusion, as if my expressing a boundary was a deviation from my assigned role. As if my discomfort was the unusual part, not the behavior that caused it. So I adjusted again. I softened my tone. I framed concerns as questions. I prefaced my feelings with disclaimers. Maybe I'm overthinking this, but this might sound silly, but I learned how to shrink my own reactions before anyone else had the chance to dismiss them. That's how normalization works. Not by force, but by repetition. And the world around us helped. Friends laughed along. Family members commented on how easy I was compared to other partners they knew. I was praised for not being demanding, not being dramatic, not being that kind of woman. Each compliment was a small removal of my right to object. I told myself I was choosing peace, that I was above petty conflicts, that I didn't want to turn every slight into a confrontation. I believed that silence was a sign of emotional intelligence. What I didn't see yet was how silence can also be interpreted as consent. The line between patience and erasure is thin. I crossed it slowly, without noticing. He started coming home later, not alarmingly late, just late enough to require explanation. And when he offered one, I accepted it. Not because it made perfect sense, but because questioning it would have disrupted the image of me as trusting and secure. When he seemed distracted, I gave space. When he was less affectionate, I assumed stress. When plans were cancelled, I told myself it was circumstantial. Every time I chose understanding over inquiry, I reinforced the idea that my emotional needs were optional. And then came the subtle reframing. If I felt disconnected, it was because I was too closed off. If I sensed distance, it was because I was hard to read. If something felt wrong, it was because I was overanalyzing. Notice how clean that is. No accusations, just gentle redirection. Back onto me. I didn't argue because there was nothing concrete to argue with. Just tone, just an implication, just a growing sense that the ground beneath me was shifting while everyone insisted it was stable. What made it hardest was that I was still being treated kindly. There was no overt hostility, no clear villain, just a gradual erosion of mutuality. I began to feel like a supporting character in my own relationship. Necessary, but not central. And still, I stayed quiet. Not because I was afraid of the truth, but because part of me sensed that once I spoke clearly, I would no longer be able to pretend this was normal. And I wasn't ready to lose the version of myself who believed that patience would eventually be rewarded. It didn't happen in a single moment. There was no announcement, no explicit agreement. The role I was given formed gradually through repetition and expectation until one day I realized I was performing it automatically. I was the reliable one, not the woman who was pursued or protected or checked in on, but the one who made things work, the one who absorbed inconvenience without comment, the one whose needs were assumed to be minimal because they were rarely expressed. I was the emotional infrastructure. Once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. He depended on my steadiness, but he no longer invested in it. He leaned on my understanding, but didn't extend the same care in return. When things went smoothly, it was because that was expected of me. When things felt off, it was subtly implied that I was the cause, too distant, too internal, too calm to be satisfied. There was an unspoken rule in place. I was allowed to support, but not to disrupt. In group settings, this role was reinforced constantly. If plans changed, people looked to me to adapt. If tension arose, I was expected to smooth it over. If someone overstepped, it was assumed I wouldn't mind. And if I did mind, I learned to mind quietly. I wasn't asked how I felt. I was expected to feel appropriately. That's the difference that matters. I began to notice how often my presence was treated as a resource rather than a relationship. I was there to stabilize, to validate, to reassure. But when I needed reassurance, real reassurance, not platitudes, it felt out of place, almost disruptive. You're usually so grounded. I didn't think this would bother you. You're stronger than this. Strength in this context meant convenience. The more I fulfilled the role, the more invisible I became. Not because I lacked substance, but because I made it so easy for others to move past me without resistance. And I let them. I told myself I was choosing maturity, that I didn't want to create unnecessary tension. Those relationships required compromise, and this was just how mine looked. But compromise assumes mutual adjustment. What I was doing was accommodation without reciprocity. I was the one expected to bend, to absorb, to adapt. And because I did it well, it became the standard. My silence was no longer neutral. It was interpreted as endorsement. The most unsettling realization wasn't that he had stopped seeing me clearly. It was that he no longer expected me to see myself clearly either. He spoke with certainty about what I could handle, what I needed, and what I would tolerate. And when I didn't immediately contradict him, those assumptions hardened into facts. This is how roles become cages. They don't require force, they require consistency. I wasn't being mistreated in a way that would alarm anyone else. That's what made it so isolating. From the outside, everything looked functional, calm, stable, but inside, something was shrinking. I had become so practiced at being easy to be with that I forgot how to be fully present with myself. My reactions were filtered, my feelings were delayed, my instincts were questioned before they were trusted. I wasn't unhappy in a way that demanded immediate action. I was unsettled in a way that demanded awareness. And awareness, once it arrives, changes everything. Because the moment I recognized the role I had been assigned, the dependable, forgiving, endlessly understanding partner, I also recognized something else. Roles only work when you continue to play them. And for the first time, I wondered what would happen if I didn't. The shift didn't come with anger. There was no confrontation, no sudden revelation, no moment where I caught him in a lie, and everything snapped into focus. It was quieter than that, almost disappointingly ordinary. It happened on a weekday evening. I was alone in our apartment, sitting at the small table by the window, reviewing documents for work. Outside, the city moved the way it always did. Cars passing, lights changing, people living entire lives without knowing mine was in the middle of a quiet reconfiguration. He was late. Again, not late enough to cause concern, just late enough to be predictable. He sent a brief message. Running behind. Don't wait up. I stared at my phone longer than necessary. Not because I didn't believe him, but because I noticed how little emotion the message stirred in me. No irritation, no worry, just confirmation. Something aligned in that moment. I realized I had already adjusted my expectations so many times that there was nothing left to adjust. The role I'd been playing, patient, understanding, endlessly flexible, had reached its limit, not outwardly, but internally. And instead of sadness, what I felt was clarity. I closed my laptop and sat there, not scrolling, not distracting myself, just listening to the quiet. And for the first time in a long while, I let myself ask a question I had been avoiding. If nothing changes, can I live like this indefinitely? The answer came quickly, calmly, without drama. No, not because I was miserable, not because everything was broken, but because I could see the trajectory clearly now, and I knew where it led. I wasn't angry at him in that moment. I wasn't even disappointed in the way people expect disappointment to look. I was aware, fully, unmistakably aware. And awareness has weight. I thought about how often I'd been spoken for, how often my silence had been interpreted as approval, how often I'd carried emotional responsibility without acknowledgement. I saw the pattern, not just in him, but in myself. And here's the part that matters. I didn't decide to confront him. I decided to stop correcting reality for him. That night, when he came home, I greeted him the same way I always did. No coldness, no edge. We talked about neutral things. He didn't notice anything different, but I did. I noticed how easily I could step back internally without stepping away physically. How could we observe instead of absorb? How could moments pass without smoothing them over? It wasn't punishment. It wasn't a strategy yet. It was detachment. For the first time, I stopped asking myself how to make things better and started asking how things actually were, without editing, without justification. That was the shift. Not a decision to leave, not a plan to expose, just a quiet recalibration of where my energy went. I stopped filling in emotional gaps that weren't mine to fill. I stopped anticipating needs that were never reciprocated. I stopped volunteering explanations for his behavior that he hadn't offered himself. And something interesting happened. Nothing exploded. The world didn't end. The relationship didn't immediately collapse. He didn't suddenly change. But the imbalance became visible because I was no longer compensating for it. That night, lying in bed, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Stillness, not numbness, not resignation, just stillness. The kind that comes when you stop fighting your own perception. I didn't sleep badly. I didn't cry. I didn't spiral. I rested. And in that rest, something settled into place. A boundary I didn't need to announce. I didn't scream. I didn't demand answers. I didn't force clarity through confrontation. I waited, not passively, but intentionally. Because once you see the truth clearly, you don't need to chase it. You just need to stop getting in its way. At first, my silence looked exactly the same as it always had. That was the irony of it. To anyone watching, including him, nothing had changed. I was still calm, still composed, still accommodating on the surface. The difference wasn't in what I said or did. It was in what I stopped doing. I stopped cushioning his discomfort. Before, if something felt tense, I would soften it with humor or reassurance. If he seemed distracted, I would fill the space with understanding. If plans fell through, I would immediately offer alternatives, explanations, excuses, anything to keep things smooth. Now, I didn't. I let pauses exist. When he came home late, I didn't ask why. Not pointedly, not casually. I acknowledged his presence and continued with whatever I was doing. No interrogation, no emotional accounting. He mistook this for acceptance. When he cancelled plans, I didn't rearrange my schedule to accommodate him later. I simply went ahead with my own evening. If he noticed the difference, he didn't mention it. And that told me something important. My previous effort had been invisible labor. As I withdrew that labor, the imbalance became more pronounced. Not because I highlighted it, but because I stopped hiding it. Silence, when it's intentional, changes how you listen. I heard things more clearly, not just words, but patterns. I noticed how often conversations centered on his experiences, his stress, and his needs. I noticed how rarely he asked follow up questions about mine. None of this was new. What was new was that I wasn't compensating for it emotionally. He began to assume I was simply being easy again, unbothered, secure. The irony was almost painful. The quieter I became internally, the more confident he seemed that everything was fine. Silence is dangerous when it's misinterpreted. I wasn't withdrawing affection or giving the cold shoulder. I wasn't trying to provoke a reaction. I was present, but no longer performing reassurance on demand. And because he had grown accustomed to my emotional availability, he didn't notice its absence right away. That's how people misunderstand quiet strength. They think it's still there, working for them. During this time, I started paying attention to my own rhythms again. I made plans without consulting him. I spent time alone without justifying it. I stopped narrating my internal state to make others comfortable. This wasn't punishment, it was reclamation. The more I did this, the more I realized how often my silence in the past had been reactive, me holding things in to keep peace. Now, my silence was proactive. It created space, space to observe, space to decide. I began writing again, not journaling in an emotional sense, but recording facts, dates, conversations, moments that felt slightly off. Not to build a case, at least not consciously, but to anchor myself in reality. Because gaslighting doesn't always come as denial. Sometimes it comes as a tone, as an implication, as being told gently and repeatedly that you're imagining things. Facts counter that. As my silence continued, he grew more comfortable, more careless. The small inconsistencies in his stories became more noticeable, not because they were extreme, but because I wasn't smoothing them over in my own mind anymore. He thought my calm meant safety. He didn't realize it meant I was no longer protecting him from the consequences of his own behavior. There's a moment in every imbalance where the person benefiting from it believes it's permanent. That belief makes them sloppy. I didn't rush that moment. I let it come to me because silence, when chosen, isn't emptiness. It's preparation. There's a particular kind of invisibility that comes from being underestimated. It doesn't feel like rejection. It feels like being overlooked while still being present. You're in the room. You're part of the system, but no one is paying close attention to what you're actually doing. That's where I found myself. As my silence continued, people, including him, filled in the blanks with assumptions. They assumed I was fine, that I was still accommodating, that I wasn't paying attention because I wasn't asking questions. What they never noticed was that I was watching everything. I wasn't looking for proof of betrayal. I wasn't hunting for a secret. I was observing behavior the way I always had. Only now, I wasn't emotionally invested in correcting it. Patterns became clearer when I stopped intervening. I noticed timing first. When he was most distracted, when he was most attentive, the rhythm of his availability, how certain explanations appeared only on certain days, how his phone habits shifted subtly, not dramatically, just enough to register if you weren't dismissing your own perception. I didn't touch his phone. I didn't need to. I noticed how often he stepped outside to take calls, how notifications were silenced at home but active elsewhere, how certain names came up in conversation casually, then disappeared entirely. None of this was explosive. It was cumulative. I also noticed myself, how my body responded before my mind caught up. A tightening in my chest when stories didn't align, a stillness when something felt rehearsed. I stopped overriding those signals with logic. At the same time, I began quietly positioning myself. I reviewed joint finances, not suspiciously, but thoroughly. I reacquainted myself with accounts I hadn't checked closely in a while. I organized documents, not out of fear, but out of responsibility. This was something I'd always been good at: preparation without panic. I updated my personal records, secured copies of important files, made sure my own accounts were current and independent. These weren't dramatic moves, they were subtle acts of self respect. He didn't notice. Why would he? I'd always handled details. This looked exactly like the role I'd always played, only now, the work was serving me. I also began expanding my world quietly, reconnecting with people I trusted, investing more energy into my own work, taking on a project that required long term focus. My life didn't shrink when I became quiet, it widened. From the outside, everything looked stable. From the inside, I was aligning myself with reality. There's a moment in these stories where people expect a big discovery: an open laptop, a message found at the wrong time, a confession overheard. That's not how it happened. What I discovered was leverage, not in the sense of control over him, but in the sense of control over my options. I was no longer trapped in uncertainty because I was no longer avoiding it. I understood the situation well enough to know I didn't need to confront it yet. The truth was unfolding on its own. And because no one believed I was capable of doing anything quietly decisive, no one interfered. That's the advantage of being underestimated. People don't hide things from you very carefully. They just assume you won't look. I wasn't angry during this phase. I wasn't even hurt in the way people imagine hurt should look like. I felt steady, grounded, focused. I wasn't waiting for permission to act. I was waiting for clarity to finish forming. And it did. Not in a single moment, but in a calm accumulation of facts that no longer required interpretation. By the time I knew exactly what was happening, I was already prepared for what came next. And that preparation, quiet, patient, invisible, was the one thing they never noticed at all. The moment of certainty didn't arrive with shock. There was no rush of adrenaline, no trembling hands, no sudden collapse of denial. When the truth finally settled into place, it did so gently, almost respectfully, as if it knew I was ready for it. I didn't catch him. I confirmed him. That distinction matters. By the time the final pieces aligned, I wasn't searching anymore. I was verifying what my intuition had already organized. The patterns I'd been observing, the timing, the emotional distance, the selective transparency, clicked into a complete picture that no longer required interpretation. It wasn't dramatic, it was clinical. I remember sitting alone in my car, parked on a quiet street, engine off. I had just finished a routine errand, nothing cinematic. The world moved normally around me. People walked dogs. Someone laughed nearby. Life continued, indifferent to the internal line I had just crossed. I took a slow breath and thought, so this is what clarity feels like. Not rage, not devastation, relief. Because uncertainty is far more exhausting than truth. I didn't confront him that night, or the next day, or even the week after. There was no urgency anymore. Urgency belongs to people who are still trying to be chosen. I was already choosing myself. What surprised me most was how calm my body felt. I had expected grief to hit first, or anger, or humiliation. Instead, I felt grounded, almost anchored. The waiting I'd done had prepared me for this moment. I wasn't scrambling for understanding. I had it. And with understanding came leverage. Not over him, but over my next move. I reviewed everything again, slowly. Financial details, shared obligations, personal assets, legal boundaries. I didn't rush. I didn't dramatize. I treated it like any other serious decision that deserved respect and thoroughness. This wasn't revenge. This was self-governance. I didn't tell anyone. Not friends, not family. Not because I was ashamed, but because outside voices would have pulled me back into reaction. Everyone would have had an opinion on what I should do next. I didn't want that noise. I wanted precision. I wanted my response to be irreversible. Not emotionally explosive, but structurally sound. During this time, he grew more comfortable. There's something unsettling about how relaxed people become when they believe the ground beneath them is stable. He assumed my quiet meant forgiveness before there was even something acknowledged to forgive. He began to rewrite the story casually. He talked about feeling misunderstood, about how relationships go through phases, about how stress changes people. None of it was directed at me explicitly, but it was offered as preemptive framing. I listened, not to internalize it, but to understand how he would later justify himself. That knowledge mattered. When people tell you who they're going to be in the aftermath, it's wise to believe them. Privately, I crossed a threshold. I stopped asking whether I was allowed to feel what I felt. I stopped negotiating with the past. I accepted the present fully, without editing it to be more tolerable. That acceptance didn't make me colder, it made it clearer. I slept well during that time, ate normally, worked effectively. There was no outward sign that anything had changed. And that invisibility protected me. Because once people sense confrontation coming, they start managing perception. They lie better. They hide more carefully. They prepare defenses. I didn't give him that opportunity. The reveal was private because it needed to be. It wasn't something to announce. It was something to act on. An action, I learned, doesn't require noise. It requires timing. By the time I was done preparing, there was no version of the future where I remained in the role I'd been assigned. The only question left was how the transition would unfold. I already knew the answer. Quietly, deliberately, without asking for understanding from someone who had already demonstrated they didn't value it. The truth had done its work. Now it was my turn. Once you see the truth clearly, indecision becomes a form of dishonesty with yourself. That's what surprised me most at this stage. Not how painful the options were, but how cleanly they presented themselves. There were no blurred edges anymore, no emotional fog, just a small number of paths, each with consequences I could now evaluate without flinching. I didn't rush the decision. I laid the options out the way I do with complex work problems, quietly, methodically, without romanticism. I could confront him immediately, force a confession, demand accountability. That path promised emotional release, maybe even temporary relief. But it also guaranteed chaos, explanations, defensiveness, rewriting, negotiation. I would be pulled back into managing his emotions, his regret, his narrative. I could stay and try to repair what was broken, ask for honesty, request counseling, rebuild trust from a place already compromised. That path required him to become someone he had shown no evidence of wanting to be. It also required me to unsee what I now knew. Or I could choose the option no one ever prepares for. I could exit the role entirely, not dramatically, not angrily, but structurally, legally, financially, emotionally. I could stop participating before the story became louder and more damaging. I could let reality speak for itself. This was the irreversible option. Because once you begin moving in alignment with the truth, quietly, thoroughly, you don't go back to pretending. I spent days making this decision, not pacing, not agonizing, just sitting with it during ordinary moments, on walks, while cooking, while reviewing work files. I watched how my body responded to each imagined future. Confrontation made me tense. The repair made me tired. Leaving made me calm. That told me everything I needed to know. People often think the hardest part is deciding to leave. It wasn't. The hardest part was accepting that I didn't need him to understand my reasons in order for them to be valid. I didn't need his agreement. I didn't need his apology. I didn't need him to see me clearly now, after failing to do so for so long. What I needed was coherence between what I knew and how I lived. So I chose the irreversible option, not because it was cruel, but because it was honest. I didn't announce the decision. I didn't change my behavior outwardly. I simply committed to a direction internally, and that commitment reorganized everything. Once the decision was made, my energy sharpened. I wasn't scattered anymore. I wasn't waiting for new information. I was executing a plan that protected my future without endangering my present. There's a strange peace that comes when you stop negotiating with someone who doesn't know they're in a negotiation. He still thought there was time. Those things were stable. That my calm meant continuity. I let him believe that. Because the decision point isn't about fairness in the moment. It's about alignment in the long run. And I had finally aligned myself with the truth. Without needing permission, validation, or spectacle. The next phase wouldn't be emotional. It would be logistical. And by the time anyone noticed what I was doing, it would already be done. Once the decision was made, everything slowed down and became sharper at the same time. This is the part people misunderstand when they imagine leaving. They picture packing bags in the middle of the night, tearful phone calls, dramatic ultimatums. That wasn't my reality. Mine was quieter, more procedural, almost boring if you didn't know what it meant. I moved in silence because silence protected clarity. I started with the practical things, the unglamorous details that shape your future long after emotions fade. I consulted a lawyer, not in a rush, not with accusations, but with questions. I wanted to understand my position, my rights, my responsibilities, knowledge first, emotion later. I separated finances methodically. I didn't drain accounts or make gestures designed to punish. I ensured transparency, balance, clean lines. Every move I made could withstand daylight, scrutiny, and time. That mattered to me. I updated the documents, redirected income, secured personal records. I changed nothing that would alert him prematurely. From the outside, everything looked normal. Bills were paid, schedules held, conversations stayed polite. He still believed we were in a quiet phase, one of those stretches relationships go through, where things are a little distant, but fundamentally intact. He didn't realize that distance and detachment are not the same thing. Emotionally, I continued to step back. I didn't ask questions designed to create closeness. I didn't offer reassurance designed to stabilize him. I responded, but I didn't overextend. This wasn't manipulation. It was the withdrawal of labor I had been providing for free. I also prepared my exit in ways no one ever warns you about. I thought about timing, about logistics, about how to leave without unnecessary cruelty, but also without sacrificing myself to protect his comfort. I wasn't trying to surprise him, I was trying to leave cleanly. The strange thing was how easy it was once I stopped explaining myself internally. Once I accepted that I didn't owe him early warning of a decision, he hadn't earned the right to influence. During this time, he became more relaxed. There's a cruel irony in that. He felt safer the less I engaged emotionally. He mistook my composure for resolution. He even made future plans casually, things he assumed we'd do together months from now. I didn't correct him. Not because I was avoiding conflict, but because correcting him would have served his timeline, not mine. Every step I took reduced my dependence on him and increased my independence. Quietly, invisibly, without confrontation. I wasn't angry while doing this. I was focused. Focus has a different energy. It doesn't leak. It doesn't announce itself. There were moments of sadness, of course. Grief doesn't require drama to exist. But grief didn't slow me down. It coexisted with purpose. I understood something important then. Moving in silence isn't about secrecy. It's about sovereignty. I wasn't hiding what I was doing. I was simply not inviting interference. By the time the final pieces were in place, my life was already structurally separate from his in all the ways that mattered. Emotionally, financially, legally. The only thing left was the moment of acknowledgement. And when that moment came, it wouldn't be explosive. It would be final. Because silence doesn't rush. It waits until action speaks for itself. Consequences rarely arrive all at once. They start as absences. The first thing he noticed wasn't anger or accusation. It was missing resistance. I no longer filled in the emotional gaps he created. When he forgot something, it stayed forgotten. When he was vague, I didn't clarify on his behalf. When he was distracted, I didn't pull him back into focus. At first, he seemed relieved, less friction, fewer questions, more freedom. He didn't understand that what felt like ease to him was actually withdrawal. The second thing he noticed was the inconvenience. Small things, practical things. The kinds of things I'd always handled quietly without fanfare. Appointments that weren't scheduled, details that weren't followed up on, loose ends that stayed loose. He asked once, lightly, did we already take care of that? I answered honestly, calmly. No, you'd need to handle it. It wasn't said with resentment, it was said with neutrality. That neutrality unsettled him more than anger ever could have, because anger implies engagement. Neutrality implies a conclusion. Slowly, the structure he'd relied on without acknowledging began to weaken. Not because I dismantled it, but because I stopped holding it together. He started to feel it at work. His focus slipped. Deadlines felt heavier. The emotional grounding he'd unconsciously leaned on was gone, and he didn't know why. People around him noticed changes before he did. He became defensive in conversations, less patient, more reactive. He talked about stress more but without clarity. He felt off balance and couldn't name the cause. I watched this from a distance, not with satisfaction, but with recognition. This is what happens when someone confuses support with entitlement. The loss feels external, but it's internal. He tried, subtly, to re-establish the old dynamic. Small gestures, casual affection, light humor. He expected me to respond the way I always had. I didn't. Not coldly, not cruelly, just differently. I didn't lean in. I didn't pull away. I remained exactly where I was, present, but no longer available for emotional maintenance. That's when confusion set in. He asked if something was wrong. I answered truthfully, I'm okay. That answer frustrated him because okay offered no entry point, no problem to solve, no emotion to manage. As the days passed, the consequences expanded outward. His assumptions stopped working. His explanations felt thinner. The confidence that came from believing I would always be there, absorbing, adjusting, forgiving, began to crack. He started blaming circumstances. Work was demanding. People were difficult. Nothing felt stable lately. He never said my name in those complaints. He didn't have to. I could see the realization forming slowly, painfully. Something essential had shifted, and he didn't know how or when. That's the cost of ignoring quiet signals. By the time the consequences are visible, the cause is already behind you. I didn't confront him during this phase. I didn't explain what was happening. I let the imbalance reveal itself naturally. Because when people lose something they never acknowledged valuing, the confusion is its own reckoning. And this was only the beginning. By the time panic appeared, it was already misplaced. It didn't arrive as guilt or remorse or even honesty. It arrived as urgency. The sudden need to do something without fully understanding what had been lost. He started paying closer attention to me, not in the way that comes from renewed respect, but in the way people do when they sense a resource slipping out of reach. His questions became more frequent. His tone is more careful. He tried to reinsert himself into my emotional space, as if proximity alone could restore balance. Have I done something? You've been distant lately. Are we okay? Each question came too late, and without the curiosity they would have required earlier. I answered calmly. I didn't deflect. I didn't reassure. We're not the same, I said once. Not accusatory, just factual. That unsettled him more than any accusation could have. He began offering fixes without fully naming the problem. Suggestions floated up, trips we could take, routines we could rebuild, conversations we could finally have. He talked about working on things in the abstract, as if effort itself were the solution. But effort without accountability is just noise. What he never offered, what never appeared, was full ownership. There was no unprompted honesty, no acknowledgement of betrayal. no recognition of the emotional imbalance he'd benefited from. He wanted restoration without excavation, and that wasn't possible. I could see the panic behind his eyes now, the disorientation, the dawning understanding that whatever had been sustaining him wasn't guaranteed anymore. But panic is self centered by nature. It asks, how do I stop this from happening to me? Not, how did I cause this? He tried to rewrite the timeline. He spoke as if the distance had come out of nowhere, as if I'd changed suddenly, as if my silence were the problem, not the consequence. I didn't argue with that framing. I didn't need to. The truth doesn't require constant defense once you've stopped living against it. There were moments when I could see him searching my face for something: anger, grief, desperation, something he could respond to, something familiar. But I didn't give him that. Not out of cruelty, out of completion. This is the part people rarely understand. When you do your grieving before you leave, there's very little left to perform at the end. I had already mourned the relationship while still inside it. I had already let go of the version of him I hoped might show up if I just stayed patient enough. What remained wasn't resentment, it was resolved. He asked once, almost pleading, "Is there anything I can do to fix this?" I paused, not for effect, but because the answer deserved honesty. "No," I said, "not now." That was the moment it landed, not because of my tone, but because of the finality of it. He wanted urgency to change the outcome. He wanted a last minute effort to outweigh months of quiet neglect. He wanted a chance to undo something he had never believed was real. But consequences don't move on emotional timelines. They arrive when preparation meets reality. By then, everything I needed was already in place: emotionally, logistically, internally. This wasn't punishment. It was simply too late. The confrontation, when it finally happened, didn't look like one. There was no raised voice, no accusations fired back and forth, no dramatic unveiling of evidence. Just two people sitting across from each other. The air unusually still, as if the room itself understood that something had already ended. I chose the timing carefully, not to control him, but to respect myself. I didn't want the conversation hijacked by emotion or defensiveness. I wanted it to be accurate. I told him I was leaving, not thinking about it, not needing space. Leaving. He stared at me, searching for a tone shift that never came. He asked why. Of course he did. People always ask why, even when they already know. So I told him the truth. Not every detail, not every moment I documented, just enough to be unmistakable. I told him I knew about the cheating, that I had known for some time, that I had chosen not to confront it immediately because I needed clarity, not reaction. His face changed, not with anger, but with shock. The kind that comes from realizing someone has been awake while you assumed they were asleep. He tried to explain, to contextualize, to minimize, not maliciously, almost reflexively, as if offering reasons could still shift the outcome. I let him speak. I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct every inconsistency. I didn't need to. Because the purpose of this conversation wasn't to uncover the truth, it was to acknowledge it. When he finished, I said something simple. I didn't scream. I waited. That was worse. The words landed heavily between us. He asked why I hadn't said anything sooner. Why hadn't he been given a chance to fix it? I answered honestly, because I was paying attention to who you were when you thought you were safe. There was nothing left to debate after that. He asked if I hated him. I didn't. Hate requires attachment. I was past that. What I felt was clarity and a quiet sadness for what could have existed if mutual respect had been present earlier. I told him I wasn't interested in public blame or private bargaining, that I wouldn't be telling a dramatic story about him to justify myself, that I simply needed to leave the role I had been playing. He nodded slowly, as if understanding came in fragments. I stood up. That movement, simple, unceremonious, felt more final than any speech could have. The confrontation ended the way it began, quietly. No winners, no spectacle, just the undeniable sound of something closing. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel the need to explain myself to anyone in the room. After I left, people expected a transformation. They looked for signs of reinvention, new habits, new anger, new declarations. They wanted a narrative arc they could recognize, something dramatic enough to justify what had happened. What they got instead was continuity. I didn't change into someone louder or harder. I didn't adopt bitterness as armor. I didn't become suspicious of everyone who showed interest in me. I remained myself. But clearer, the biggest difference was where my energy went. I no longer invest in being misunderstood. I no longer volunteered emotional labor to stabilize people who hadn't earned it. I became more selective, not closed, just precise. I noticed how often I used to shrink in conversations, how often I softened my opinions to avoid discomfort. That habit faded naturally once I stopped needing to maintain harmony at my own expense. Clarity has a way of simplifying things. I began trusting my perceptions again without running them through layers of justification. If something felt off, I paid attention. If someone overstepped, I addressed it calmly, or I disengaged. No rehearsed explanations, no emotional bargaining. People responded differently to me. Some felt unsettled. They couldn't quite place the change, but they sensed it. Others leaned in with respect they hadn't shown before, not because I demanded it, but because I no longer made it optional. I learned that quiet doesn't have to mean inaccessible. It can mean sovereign. My life became smaller in the best way. Fewer entanglements, fewer explanations, fewer roles I never agreed to. What remained felt intentional, grounded, mine. I also realized the need to make sense of his behavior beyond what was necessary for closure. Understanding doesn't always bring peace. Sometimes it just prolongs attachment. I wished him no harm, but I no longer wished him well at my own expense. The part of me that once believed endurance was proof of love softened into something wiser. I learned that love without mutual respect is just self abandonment with good intentions. And I stopped doing that. Now, when I'm quiet, it's not because I'm shrinking, it's because I'm listening to myself first. When I speak, it's not to maintain balance, it's to state reality. I'm still underestimated occasionally. Old habits die slowly in others. But now, that underestimation doesn't confuse me or lure me into overcompensating. I let people reveal how deeply they're willing to see me, and I decide accordingly. I didn't scream, I didn't beg, I didn't fight to be chosen. I waited, and in that waiting, I chose myself. There's a version of this story that would be easier to tell, one where the lesson is loud, where betrayal is met with confrontation, where justice arrives in a single, satisfying moment, where the ending is clear, dramatic, and unmistakable. But that's not how this one ends, because the truth is quieter. The real shift didn't happen when he cheated. It didn't even happen when I found out. It happened when I stopped explaining myself to survive a situation that required honesty to escape. For a long time, I believed that being patient made me mature, that being understanding made me loving, that staying calm made me strong. And in the right context, those things can be true. But when patience becomes permission, when understanding becomes erasure, when calm becomes a tool others use to bypass accountability, that's not virtue anymore. That's self betrayal. What I learned, slowly and without drama, is that silence is not weakness. Silence is neutral. What gives it power or danger is why you're silent. When silence is used to disappear, it destroys you. When silence is used to observe, prepare, and choose, it protects you. I didn't win because he lost. He lost because he assumed I would always be there to absorb the cost of his choices. And when I stopped doing that, reality did the rest. There was no revenge, no humiliation, no public reckoning, just consequences. The kind that arrive when someone mistakes your presence for permanence and your forgiveness for entitlement. If there's a moral here, it's not leave sooner or never trust. It's simpler and harder than that. Pay attention to how people behave when they think you won't leave, not when they're trying to impress you, not when they're apologizing, but when they believe they're safe. That version of them is the truth. And you don't need to confront it loudly to respect yourself. You just need to stop carrying what was never yours to hold. I didn't scream. I didn't wait to be rescued. I waited until I could act without losing myself. And that was enough. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt underestimated, quietly blamed, or slowly erased while being told you were strong, I'd like to hear from you. What did you notice only after you stopped speaking up to keep the peace?
Video của mình hôm nay đến đây là kết thúc. Nếu bạn thích video này, hãy cho mình xin một lượt like và một lượt đăng ký kênh. Hẹn gặp lại các bạn ở trong những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.